Bobby Fischer's opponent in this incredible game is Viktor Korchnoi. Now, Korchnoi is an elite player who is known historically as probably being the greatest chess player in history to never have won a world championship match. And he was great for a long time. He was ranked 85th in the world at the age of 75, a real marvel. But I doubt that either he or Fischer knew the importance of this game at the time when it was played. Korchnoi would later defect from the Soviet Union and move to Switzerland. And he did that, as we have come to understand it, because it was believed by the Soviet authorities that he just wasn't quite good enough to compete against Bobby Fischer. Remember, in '76, people didn't know Fischer wasn't going to play again. They thought he might come back. So that belief that he was not going to get the support that he needed and was kind of going to get pushed aside caused him to defect. And it's quite possible that this game was the primary reason for that. Fischer has white, Korchnoi has black. This was played at the Stockholm Interzonal in 1962. Let us jump right in. E4, E5, knight F3, knight C6, and of course, Fischer's favorite, Ruy Lopez. A6, bishop to A4, knight F6, attacking the E4 pawn. Castles, bishop to E7, rook to E1 defends that pawn. And now, of course, black gains space with B5, pushing the bishop to B3. And after castling, C3 from white. Of course, this move, it gives the bishop a place to hide at C2, prepares the move D2, D4, and also keeps the knight out of D4 or B4. Korchnoi plays a standard D6, and here, usually Fischer would play H3. This is the main move here, preventing the pin by the bishop. But Fischer goes ahead and plays D4 immediately here, allowing that pin, and Korchnoi does play the pin, putting pressure on D4 by pinning the knight that defends it. So Fischer has created a pawn center very quickly, but Korchnoi is going to get a chance to put some pressure on it. Let's see how that works out. Fischer plays bishop to E3, adding another piece to defend that D4 pawn. That does leave this E4 pawn undefended. And if Korchnoi had chosen to take that pawn, then bishop to D5 is a double attack against those two knights. It looks like Fischer would win a knight. Actually, it doesn't quite work out that way. After queen to D7, bishop takes knight, black can play D5, and this recovers the piece when the bishop moves E4, and there's a pin on this knight. However, when the dust settles, white has a better position. The queen can go to D3, threatening H7, A4 to work on these weaknesses. So black does not take the pawn at E4, long story short. He takes on D4, CD4, and now knight to A5. This knight is not nearly as strong as this bishop here. Black would love to take that bishop off of the board, so Fischer, of course, will not allow that. But now the knight jumps into the nice C4 square, hitting the bishop at E3 and also the pawn at B2. So the bishop retreats to C1 to defend that pawn and save itself. And we see here a very intense battle over the bishop pair. Both sides want to get the pair of bishops versus the other. Korchnoi plays C5, advancing in the center. And now B3. Fischer is playing against this knight. He wants to take as many of its squares away from it as possible. After he plays knight to A5 in response, maybe knight to B6 was a little better. But after knight to A5, boom, D5. Gaining space and taking away this natural C6 square away from the knight. The only square it can land on is B7, which is a pretty clunky square for that knight. Knight to D7, clearing the way for the bishop to go to F6 and take advantage of this nice long dark square diagonal. The knight at some point could go to E5 or even C5 once the pawn advances. Knight b to D2, bishop to F6, attacking that rook, so the rook moves over to B1. And now C4. What Korchnoi is doing is advancing his queenside pawn majority, which is the main source of his counterplay, and trying to make this knight on the side of the board as useful as possible. He wants it to achieve something here and become active instead of being stuck on the side of the board. Here Fischer plays H3, and while Korchnoi could retreat the bishop and allow Fischer to gain space on the king's side, Fischer has a pretty good position here. So instead, he goes ahead and grabs that knight, and after knight takes F3, Fischer has won the first major strategical battle here. He has the bishop pair. So that's a nice victory strategically for Bobby Fischer. Korchnoi takes on B3. You would never want to take this with your bishop, by the way, because then the knight would just chop off the bishop, and there will be no punishment for the knight being on the side of the board. So Fischer takes with the pawn. again, to limit this knight's possible landing spots. Queen to c7, preparing play down the only open file, the c file. Fischer plays bishop to e3, and here Korchnoi makes a very interesting move. He plays the move bishop to c3, not only harassing this bishop at e1, but preparing to play b4 and sort of screw that bishop in on that c3 square. So the c3 square could be a very good square for black. The only problem is it's really hard to get a knight there. You'd rather have a knight on that square, but it's still a good square for the black position. Rook to e2 to avoid that threat. Now b4, defending that bishop and taking advantage of the c3 weakness. Knight to d4 from Fischer. He has some squares of his own. That knight would like to go to f5, where it creates a lot of problems for black. Rook f to e8. What if Korchnoi just takes that knight? That would be a strategic mistake, because after bishop recaptures, this dark square bishop has no opponent, and this would be a tremendous position for white. That would be a bad exchange of pieces. So he does not do that. Rook f to e8, putting pressure on e4. Now knight to f5. Now, neither d6 or g7 are hanging right now, but this pressure is still uncomfortable, and it's beginning to build. Knight to b7, defending d6, and perhaps that knight can jump into c5, finally activating that knight on a5, but it has taken a lot of moves to do that. Now Fischer plays bishop to d4. He wants the dark squared bishop off of the board. He's willing to give up his own dark squared bishop to do that. That's not as bad an exchange for black. But if he takes here, then queen takes d4. Of course, white's threatening mate at g7 at the moment. But then queen to c3 defends after queen c3, bishop, b takes c3, the b pawn. Then rook to e3, and white has a nice position. The rook is threatening c3, threatening to go to g3, hitting g7. There's pressure on d6. White would be in a decent shape there. So instead of that, Korchnoi plays g6, trying to kick the knight away from f5. So Fischer plays knight to h6 check. The king goes to f8, which as it must, as the bishop controls these squares. King to f8, and now rook to c1. Fischer is annoyed by this bishop, and he's trying to pry open that c file and get it off of the board, and he places his rook opposite the queen for maybe some future tactical pressure. Korchnoi doesn't budge. Rook a to c8, now bishop to d3, not only clearing the way for the rook to apply more pressure here, but also attacking the a6 pawn, which is now undefended. So Korchnoi plays queen to a5, defending that pawn and stepping out of the pin at the same time. Fischer continues his build-up. Rook e to c2. Now there's a pin on this bishop. He can't take on d4 because he would lose the exchange. The pressure is building. Knight to e5 from Korchnoi, attacking this bishop. Again, Fischer wants to preserve the bishop pair, so he retreats that bishop to f1. And now knight to c5. Korchnoi is attacking e4 and b3, and it looks like he has a decent position. There's no doubt Korchnoi has played very well here, and we see why he was one of the greatest players in chess history. This is no lightweight. This is a serious player, and he's doing well against Fischer. He's put pressure on b3 and e4, a double attack. Well, how does Fischer defend against the threat to these two pawns? First, he takes on c3, pawn takes bishop, and then rook takes c3. The rook defends the b3 pawn, but also there's a pin down the c file, so black cannot take the pawn at e4 with his knight either. King to g7, attacking that knight, so the knight goes to g4, putting some pressure on e5, and eventually, if he can arrange it, Fischer might want to play f4 and advance these pawns in the center. That's not easy to do at the moment, but that's maybe a hope for the future. Korchnoi grabs the knight at g4, queen takes g4 from Fischer, and this pawn is actually defended. It doesn't look defended, but if the knight takes, then the rook will take on c8, and if the rook takes, it actually just hangs the rook at c8. So the pawn stays defended. So Korchnoi plays rook to b8 to avoid that tactic, and now the pawn is under threat. He's also attacking b3 twice. But Fischer just goes ahead and plays rook to f3, giving up the pawn for pressure against Korchnoi's king. Here knight takes e4. If he plays rook takes e4, that would actually lose a piece to rook takes c5, because by taking the knight, he's counterattacking black's queen, and white would win a piece there. So he has to take with the knight, which he does. Queen to f4, attacking the f7 pawn, threatening to take it with check. Korchnoi could play rook to e7, but he decides to play the more aggressive f5. That also sort of secures that knight in place on e4. Rook to e3 from Fischer. The threat is quite simple. Just play f3, kicking the knight away, and then play queen takes d6, because then that pawn would hang. Korchnoi plays rook to e5, blocking the queen's access to d6 and adding another attacker to white's d-pawn. Rook to c6 from Fischer, attacking the a6 pawn twice. The bishop and the rook both attack the pawn. Rook b to e8, doubling up on the e-file. Rook takes d6. This works for tactical reasons. If knight takes d6, then rook takes e5. Could be played. The best move here, as modern computers show, is actually this move, g5. A very aggressive move, and this would keep black in the game and is very sharp, but theoretically it looks to be equal. Instead, Korchnoi plays queen to a1. This, of course, pins the bishop at f1 and also adds to the defense of the rook at e5. But now rook takes a6 from Fischer, queen to d4, and rook to d3. This rook, of course, is defended by the bishop. But now we see this d5 pawn as a big trump card for Fischer, and the rook is behind it with tempo, and that pawn is going to be troublesome for Korchnoi. The queen goes to b2, and now, boom, d6. Fischer begins to advance the pawn, and now Korchnoi plays that aggressive move, g5, but it's a little too late, unfortunately for him. Queen to e3 with the threat of delivering check on a7. Notice how this pawn controls the e7 square so that he couldn't interpose either of these rooks if he is checked on a7. f4 hits the queen, now queen to a7 from Bobby Fischer, and in this position, black resigned. Let's see why. If he plays the king forward to g6, or any of those squares, then d7 is a discovered check, and that would win. If this rook were to block, then he would just promote to a queen. So that does not work. But if he moves the king back to g8, then this is still strong. Advancing the pawn, and after rook to d8, necessary to stop the pawn, then queen to c7 is a double attack on those rooks, and that's enough. And black doesn't get enough with queen to f2 check, because after king to h2, there's no more checks with the queen going to g3 because the rook defends that square. So he would win in this position. Who knew how consequential this game would be in the life of Viktor Korchnoi? A masterpiece by Fischer. I hope you've enjoyed it. See you again soon at Chess Talk. Goodbye.